Right now, Lake Mead is being projected toward roughly 1,036 feet above sea level, a level that could push America's largest reservoir below its modern record low and turn a quiet federal forecast into a warning visible on stone. That number does not arrive like a wall of fire, a tornado siren, or floodwater in a street. It arrives as a line on a reservoir projection, as a pale bathtub ring on desert rock, as another marina moved, another intake watched, another power calculation adjusted. But that quietness is exactly what makes it abnormal. A reservoir built to buffer the West against dry years is no longer just buffering drought. It is becoming the place where drought, heat, law, electricity, farming, and urban growth collide. But that is not the worst part. The record low is the headline. The deeper warning is upstream, where managers have reduced releases from Lake Powell toward Lake Mead to protect Glen Canyon Dam and the upper reservoir system. In other words, Lake Mead is not simply falling, it is being asked to absorb the stress of another lake that is also too low. So the real question is not whether one reservoir breaks a record. The question is what happens when the entire Colorado River system starts choosing which weakness to protect first. Anyone following this story can like, subscribe, and comment their location, because this is no longer just a desert story, it is a system story. At Lake Mead, the crisis does not begin with panic, it begins with distance. Water that once touched marina docks now sits farther away. Ramps that once met the shoreline have had to chase it downslope. The white mineral ring on the canyon walls does not move quickly enough to look like a disaster in a single afternoon, but it records one anyway. It is a shoreline written in reverse. A map of absence, a ruler showing how much stored water the American West has already spent. The people affected by this are not only the people standing near the lake, they are spread across a vast engineered geography. They are in Las Vegas, where water conservation has become part of the city's survival machinery. They are in Phoenix and Tucson, where growth, heat, and water planning now sit in the same room. They are in farming valleys of Arizona and California, where the Colorado River is not scenery but timing, yield, debt, and payroll. They are in tribal communities, whose water rights have often been recognized on paper long before pipes, treatment plants, or funding arrived on the ground. They are in northern Mexico, where the same river crosses a border already carrying the weight of treaties, scarcity, and negotiation. And they are also in homes far from the desert, because this river moves through food prices, electricity markets, construction plans, and the political idea that a dry region can always build its way around dryness. The Bureau of Reclamation describes the Colorado River as a critical resource for 7 basin states, supporting water supply, hydropower, recreation, fish and wildlife habitat, and other benefits. It also states that between 35 and 40 million people rely on the river for some, if not all, of their municipal water needs, while agricultural uses account for about 70% of Colorado River water. That is the scale of the scene. Not one lake, not one city. A river system stretched across states, contracts, canals, farms, dams, power lines, and expectations. What is happening at Lake Mead is therefore not just a local decline in water level, it is a pressure signal. Lake Mead is the main savings account for the lower Colorado River basin, and the balance is falling toward a zone that forces hard questions out of policy documents and into daily operations. When the reservoir drops, water managers are not simply watching a gauge. They are watching intakes, turbines, legal shortage tiers, future allocations, recreation access, and emergency planning all move closer together. The official concern is written in careful language, but the meaning is blunt. Reclamation has acted to protect the Colorado River system during historic drought by reducing the amount of water released from Lake Powell to Lake Mead. That phrase can sound technical, almost distant, but in practice, it means the upper reservoir is being protected by sending less water downstream. The system is no longer only deciding how much water users can take, it is deciding how much stress each reservoir can survive. This is why the present scene is so tense. Lake Mead is not falling in isolation. It is falling inside a linked machine. Above it sits Lake Powell, held behind Glen Canyon Dam. Below it sits Hoover Dam, Las Vegas, the Central Arizona Project, irrigation districts, tribal nations, cities, hydropower customers, wildlife refuges, and Mexico. Each part depends on the others behaving within a range that engineers, lawyers, and politicians once treated as difficult but manageable. But as the water line drops, those ranges narrow. At the surface, the severity looks simple. The lake is lower, the shoreline is farther away. Boating access becomes harder. Some ramps close or become less useful. Marinas adapt. Recreational businesses lose certainty. Visitors see the bathtub ring and understand something has changed. Reclamation has warned that reduced water levels may further limit boating access at Lake Mead National Recreation Area, while related drought response actions can affect recreation at upstream reservoirs. Lower flow conditions in the Grand Canyon, rafting, and fishing. This is the visible layer, the layer tourists photograph. But the deeper severity is quieter. A low reservoir changes hydraulics. Water is heavy, and height matters. Hoover Dam does not simply need water behind it. It needs enough elevation to push water through turbines with force. When the lake is higher, the water column has more pressure. When the lake is lower, the same dam operates with less head, meaning less energy can be extracted from every unit of water. The lights do not suddenly go out because one forecast drops by a few feet. That would be an exaggeration. But the margin shrinks. A dam built as a symbol of control becomes a machine negotiating with gravity. The same is true for water delivery. A city can build deeper intakes, and southern Nevada has invested heavily in infrastructure that allows it to draw water at very low lake levels. That makes Las Vegas more resilient than it would otherwise be. But resilience in one place does not erase system stress. It shifts the question. If one city can still reach the water, what about a farming district with fewer options? If one utility can adapt, what about a small community with less money? If one reservoir is protected, what happens to the one downstream? The crisis is not only whether water exists, it is where the system can still move it, price it, pump it, treat it, and defend it. For farmers, the lake is not an abstraction. It is a calendar. Water arriving late, reduced, or uncertain, moves through soil before it ever appears in an economic report. It changes planting choices. It changes whether alfalfa is worth cutting, whether a field is left fallow, whether a family carries debt into another season, whether farm workers have steady hours, and whether a rural county loses revenue quietly, one decision at a time. The water level at Lake Mead becomes a question at the edge of a field. Should this land be irrigated, partially irrigated, leased, compensated, or abandoned for a season? For tribal nations, the scene carries another layer. Many tribes in the Colorado River Basin have senior water rights, unresolved claims, or settlements still moving through long legal and infrastructure processes. A river shortage does not fall on an empty map. It falls on a map already shaped by history. Water on paper is not the same as water in a pipe. A legal right does not fill a household tank unless treatment systems, distribution lines, funding, and governance can turn that right into delivered water. When the reservoir drops, old inequities do not stay old. They become active again. For cities, the danger is partly psychological. Urban residents often experience water as a service, not a landscape. The tap works. The bill arrives. A golf course stays green or turns less green. A pool is filled or restricted. But Lake Mead exposes the hidden chain behind that service. The chain begins in mountain snowpack, moves through soil moisture, reservoirs, canals, pumps, treatment plants, and legal agreements, then ends at a kitchen sink. When the lake falls, the viewer is forced to see the chain. And once the chain is visible, the tap no longer looks simple. The official warnings matter because they are not written like movie dialogue. They are administrative, cautious, procedural. They speak of reduced releases, shortage conditions, reservoir operations, drought response plans, and post-2026 guidelines. That language can seem less frightening than a disaster headline, but it is often more important. It means the people responsible for the river are no longer debating a distant theoretical risk. They are adjusting the machinery. The viewer should care, because Lake Mead is not just a place where water is stored. It is a test of whether 20th century infrastructure can still protect 21st century society under a hotter and drier baseline. The reservoir was built to smooth out extremes. It was meant to turn an unpredictable river into a planned supply. But when extremes last too long, the buffer becomes the warning. The cushion becomes the gauge. The savings account becomes the story. And that is why the scene at Lake Mead is so unsettling. Nothing has to collapse on camera for the crisis to be real. The warning is in the slow movement of the shoreline, the official reduction of water moving downstream, the recreational access that becomes harder, the farms that wait for allocation decisions, the turbines losing head, the cities building deeper, and the communities still waiting for water security that should have arrived generations ago. The lake is not only low, it is crowded with consequences. Every foot contains a negotiation. Every forecast contains a choice. And every choice reveals the same uncomfortable truth. The Colorado River system is being asked to do more, with less water, less margin, and less time than the old rules assumed. The headline number is not only 1,036 feet. That is the number that catchy kunit. Kunit sounds like a threshold, a line, a cliff edge. It turns Lake Mead into a single vertical measurement, as if the entire crisis can be understood by watching the surface move down a rock wall. But the more important number is measured not in feet, it is measured in acre-feet, the language of Western water, and it is the number that shows how much of the river is being allowed to move. For the coming water year, the key figure is 6 million acre-feet. That is the amount of water projected to be released from Lake Powell toward Lake Mead under the reduced operating plan. Under earlier rules, the release would have been 7.48 million acre-feet. The difference is 1.48 million acre-feet of water that would normally have moved downstream, but is now being held back to protect the upper reservoir system. That difference is easy to read past. 1.48 million acre-feet sounds like a spreadsheet entry, not a crisis, but 1 acre-foot is enough water to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. It is about 325,851 gallons, so 1.48 million acre-feet is not a small adjustment. It is roughly 482 billion gallons of water. Not millions, billions. Nearly 500 billion gallons that do not arrive at Lake Mead in the same way, at the same time, under the same old assumptions. That is the number that changes the story. A falling reservoir is dramatic. A reduced river is structural. To picture it, imagine a football field covered not with turf, but with water. 1 acre-foot is close to the amount needed to spread water across most of that field to a depth of 1 foot. Now imagine millions of those sheets of water stacked into the accounting of the Colorado River. This is how the West counts survival. It counts snowpack before it melts. It counts runoff before it reaches a canal. It counts evaporation from open reservoirs. It counts water moving through turbines, through irrigation gates, through city treatment plants, through treaties and contracts, and shortage tiers. 6 million acre-feet is still an enormous volume of water. That matters. This is not a story about a river turning instantly to dust. The Colorado River is still flowing. Cities are still taking water. Farms are still irrigating. Hoover Dam is still standing. The danger is more precise than collapse. It is that the system is now operating with numbers that would once have been treated as emergency signals, and those numbers are becoming part of ordinary planning. That is why the figure, 1,036 feet, is so disturbing. Lake Mead's elevation is not just a scenic measurement. It represents storage, pressure, access, and margin. At higher elevations, the reservoir is a bank account with room for error. A dry winter can be absorbed. A hot summer can be endured. A poor runoff year can be managed without immediate crisis. But at lower elevations, each additional foot matters more because the system has already spent so much of its buffer. The lake does not have to hit dead pool to send warnings. Long before that, the warning appears in power efficiency, pumping costs, intake planning, boating access, shortage declarations, and political negotiations. A foot of water at Lake Mead is not always the same volume, because the reservoir sits inside a canyon landscape. Its shape changes with elevation. When the lake is high, a foot can spread across broad-side canyons and submerged slopes. When it is low, the geometry changes, but the meaning of a foot becomes sharper as the lake approaches critical operating zones. A few feet can mark the difference between one management category and another, one forecast outcome and another, one round of emergency talks and another. That is the abnormal part. Reservoirs are supposed to rise and fall. That is their function. They store water in wet periods and release it in dry periods. A healthy reservoir system breathes. It fills, releases, recovers, and repeats. But Lake Mead has spent years not breathing normally. It has been exhaling more than it inhales. The white ring on the rock is not just drought. It is a memory of imbalance. The Colorado River was divided, managed, and promised during an era that assumed more water than the river now reliably provides. In simple terms, the paperwork was more confident than the climate. That does not mean every manager was careless or every city was blind. Many agencies have conserved aggressively. Southern Nevada, for example, has reduced consumptive use even while its population grew. Agricultural districts have negotiated cuts, compensation programs, and fallowing agreements. Water managers have not been asleep, but conservation is now racing a moving baseline. The river is not merely being shared. It is shrinking under heat. This is where the numbers begin to feel different. 1,036 feet is a level. 6 million acre-feet is a release. 1.48 million acre-feet is a missing downstream cushion. Together, they describe a system no longer defined by a single shortage, but by trade-offs between reservoirs. If Lake Powell is too low, Glen Canyon Dam faces operational risk and reduced hydropower capacity. If more water is held in Powell, Lake Mead loses inflow and drops faster. If Lake Mead drops, Hoover Dam faces lower head pressure, the lower basin faces deeper shortage pressure, and the political cost of water cuts rises. The problem is not that one number is bad. The problem is that every number is connected to another number that is also under stress. This is what makes the headline almost misleading. A record low suggests a moment, a date, a ranking, a dramatic comparison with the past. It invites a simple story. The lake has never been this low before, but the more important story is not whether Lake Mead crosses a record by a few feet. The more important story is whether the reservoir can recover after crossing it. A record can be temporary. A new operating reality can last. In everyday life, the difference between those two things is the difference between an overdraft fee and a lower income. An overdraft hurts once. A lower income changes every month after that. Lake Mead's projected low level is the overdraft warning. The reduced release from Lake Powell is the income problem. It means less water arriving from upstream at the very time the downstream reservoir needs help. And water, unlike money, cannot be created by policy. It can be moved, conserved, priced, traded, legally reallocated, recycled, or stored. But it cannot be negotiated into existence. The sky has to produce it. The mountains have to hold it as snow. The spring melt has to survive dry soil. The river has to carry it past thirsty landscapes and hot air. Only then can the reservoirs count it. That is why the acre-foot is such a powerful unit. It forces the story to stay physical. A foot on a gauge can look abstract, but an acre-foot is land and depth. It is a field covered in water. It is a crop decision. It is a subdivision. It is a cooling tower. It is a kitchen tap. It is a turbine turning, because gravity still has enough height to work with. When millions of acre-feet disappear from expectations, the loss moves through the system as a sequence of smaller losses. Less water in the lake, less pressure behind the dam, less flexibility for farms, less certainty for cities, less room for mistakes. The shock is not that Lake Mead may fall below a previous record. The shock is that the West can now see the record coming in official forecasts and still has to ask which reservoir to protect first. The headline number is a lake level. The hidden number is the water that is not coming down. And between those two numbers sits the real warning. The Colorado River system is no longer being tested only by drought. It is being tested by arithmetic. The part most people will remember is the lake level, 1,036 feet. A number low enough to sound like a record, low enough to make headlines, low enough to turn the cliffs around Lake Mead into a warning sign. But the lake level is only what the public can see. It is the symptom on the surface. The deeper problem is the valve upstream. That valve is Glen Canyon Dam, the concrete wall holding back Lake Powell. In a simple picture of the Colorado River, water begins high in the mountains, moves through the upper basin, enters Lake Powell, passes through Glen Canyon Dam, runs through the Grand Canyon, and eventually reaches Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam. It sounds like a river flowing downhill, but in reality, it is more like a machine with two giant pressure tanks connected by one controlled outlet. Lake Powell is the upper tank. Lake Mead is the lower tank. Glen Canyon Dam is the valve between them. When that valve releases more water, Lake Mead gets relief. When that valve releases less water, Lake Mead is forced to fall faster, unless local inflows or conservation make up the difference. And that is why this moment is different from a normal dry year. The lower basin is not just watching a reservoir shrink because the sky produced too little snow. It is watching a reservoir shrink while the federal government deliberately holds more water upstream to protect the other reservoir from falling into an even more dangerous zone. This is the part that changes the story. It is not just a lake dropping. It is a system choosing which lake gets protected first. The Bureau of Reclamation's operating plans point to the reason. Lake Powell has been threatened by extremely weak inflow, low snowpack, and the risk of approaching critical elevations for Glen Canyon Dam. If Powell falls too far, the problem is not only that a reservoir looks empty. The problem is that the dam loses the water height it needs to move water safely through power-producing works, and the upper basin loses one of its most important tools for meeting downstream obligations. Protecting Lake Powell therefore becomes a system defense. But every system defense has a cost. For Lake Mead, the cost is measured in water that does not arrive. A reduction from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet means less water moving through Glen Canyon Dam toward the lower reservoir. The difference is 1.48 million acre-feet. A volume so large that it is difficult to hold in the mind. It is not the water in a swimming pool. It is not the water in a neighborhood. It is the kind of volume that can change a reservoir's future elevation, hydropower outlook, shortage calculations, and political pressure across multiple states. This is why the phrase record low can mislead. A record low makes the crisis sound like a contest with the past. It makes the question seem simple. Has Lake Mead ever been this low before? But the real question is sharper. Why is Lake Mead being pushed lower now? And what does that reveal about the condition of the whole river system? The answer is that Lake Mead is not merely losing water, it is receiving less help. Think of two hospitals during a regional emergency. One hospital is running out of oxygen, the other is running out of beds. A central authority sends supplies to the hospital closest to immediate failure, but that decision leaves the other hospital more crowded, more strained, and more likely to face its own emergency later. No one made a careless choice. The choice was forced by scarcity. That is what the Colorado River system now looks like. It is not mismanagement in the cartoon sense of someone forgetting to open a gate. It is triage, and triage means there is no painless option left. If managers release more from Lake Powell, Mead benefits, but Powell may fall toward a level that threatens Glen Canyon Dam operations and hydropower. If managers release less from Powell, Powell is protected, but Mead declines, and Hoover Dam faces lower water pressure, lower power efficiency, and greater shortage stress downstream. If cities conserve more, the system gains time, but agricultural districts may still face deep cuts because farming uses the largest share of river water. If farms fallow land, the river gains water, But rural economies absorb the shock. Every answer moves the pain. None makes the physics disappear. That is the hidden mechanism. Not drought alone, not one bad winter alone, not one city using too much water alone. The mechanism is coupled reservoir vulnerability. Two giant reservoirs were designed to provide backup for each other and for the region below them. But when both are low, they stop behaving like backup. They begin behaving like linked weak points. The protection of one can deepen the decline of the other. This is why the valve matters more than the shoreline. A shoreline tells the viewer where water used to be. A valve tells the viewer where water is allowed to go next. The shoreline is memory. The valve is decision. And in a stressed river system, decisions become the new disaster geography. The crisis is not only drawn by nature, it is drawn by operating rules, shortage tiers, legal obligations, dam safety concerns, power contracts, and emergency actions. Lake Mead's exposed rock makes the crisis visible, but Glen Canyon Dam makes the crisis operational. At Powell, managers are trying to keep enough elevation to protect hydropower and maintain releases through a dam never designed for a permanently depleted river. At Mead, managers are trying to preserve lower basin deliveries, Hoover Dam power production, and a reservoir that supplies a vast network of cities, farms, tribes, industries, and ecosystems. These goals are not separate. They sit on the same river. That is the trap. For most of the 20th century, the great reservoirs made the Colorado River feel bigger than it was. A dry year could be hidden inside stored water. A city could keep growing because the shortage had not yet reached the tap. A farm could keep planting because upstream storage smoothed out the season. A power customer could treat hydropower as reliable because the dam still had enough water pressure behind it. The reservoirs converted uncertainty into confidence. But now the reservoirs are converting confidence back into uncertainty. A lower Lake Mead does not automatically mean a household in Las Vegas or Phoenix wakes up with no water. That is not the reality. Water systems are planned, engineered, and legally managed. Many cities have banked water, reduced per-person use, recycled more, removed grass, and built deeper intakes. The danger is not instant disappearance. The danger is the shrinking margin between normal operation and emergency operation. And shrinking margin is often how system failures begin, not with a dramatic collapse, with fewer options, with a narrower range of safe releases, with an operating plan that depends on the next snow season being better, with a dam that can still function, but with less room for error, with a city that can still pump water, but at higher cost, with a farmer who can still plant, but only if the allocation arrives, with a power grid that can still meet demand, but with less hydropower during extreme heat, with officials who can still negotiate, but under deadlines set by falling water. That is the difference between a hazard and a systemic risk. A hazard is a low lake. A systemic risk is what happens when that low lake becomes entangled with electricity, food, law, growth, debt, and trust. The record low is therefore not the scariest part. A record can be broken and later recovered. The scariest part is that the system is starting to operate as if one reservoir must be weakened to keep another from crossing a more dangerous threshold. That is a different kind of warning. It means the crisis has moved from the surface of the lake into the rules of the river. And once the crisis enters the rules, it becomes harder to photograph, but easier to feel. It appears in federal studies. It appears in emergency releases from upstream reservoirs. It appears in reduced annual release volumes. It appears in power forecasts. It appears in agricultural negotiations. It appears in the quiet language of agencies trying to avoid saying the most unsettling thing too loudly. The old system was built around the idea that stored water could buy time. Lake Mead and Lake Powell were the savings accounts of the Colorado River. But a savings account only works if deposits eventually return. If the climate grows hotter, if snowpack weakens, if soil absorbs more meltwater before it reaches the channel, and if demand remains larger than reliable supply, the account is no longer just being drawn down during emergencies. It becomes a way to postpone the recognition that income has changed. That is why the valve upstream is so important. It turns the story from a falling lake into a warning about the whole architecture of the West. Lake Mead is the place where the public sees the waterline. Lake Powell is the place where operators are trying to protect the upper system. Glen Canyon Dam is the narrow passage where those two realities meet. Not the lake level, the release, not the record. The trade-off, not the visible bathtub ring. The hidden valve deciding which part of the system absorbs the next foot of loss. The mechanism has a name, and it matters because the word drought is no longer big enough. The word is aridification. Drought usually suggests a temporary shortage. Rain fails, snowpack weakens, a dry spell arrives, damages a season, then eventually breaks. In that story, water shortage is an event. It has a beginning, a peak, and a recovery. Aridification is different. Aridification means the landscape itself is becoming more prone to dryness as the climate warms. It does not require every year to be dry. It does not mean storms stop forever. It means the same basin, under a warmer atmosphere, can turn less precipitation into usable river flow. That distinction is the center of the Lake Mead story. The reservoir is not only responding to a bad year, it is responding to a hotter water cycle. The Colorado River begins not as a giant river, but as stored cold. Snow accumulates in the Rocky Mountains. For much of the 20th century, that mountain snowpack acted like a slow-release reservoir. It held winter precipitation in place, then released it gradually as spring and early summer runoff. That timing was essential. Cities, farms, reservoirs, power plants, and legal agreements all grew around the expectation that snow would melt into a river with a certain rhythm. Aridification attacks that rhythm. A warmer atmosphere changes snow first. More winter precipitation can fall as rain instead of snow. Snow that does fall can melt earlier. Darker ground appears sooner. Once the reflective snow surface disappears, more solar energy is absorbed by land rather than bounced back into the sky. The basin heats more efficiently. Evaporation increases. Plants wake earlier and pull more water from soil. The air itself becomes thirstier because warmer air can hold more water vapor. The result is not one dramatic leak. It is thousands of small withdrawals before water ever reaches the river channel. This is why a snowpack number can look encouraging and still fail to produce the runoff people expect. Snow on a mountain is not the same as water in Lake Mead. Between the mountain and the reservoir, the water must survive warmth, wind, soil, vegetation, sunlight, groundwater loss, irrigation demands, and reservoir evaporation. A hotter basin takes a larger tax at every step. The most important phrase is snowmelt efficiency. It means how much of the mountain snow actually becomes streamflow. In a cooler system, more meltwater can move downhill into creeks, tributaries, and reservoirs. In a hotter and drier system, more of that meltwater disappears into thirsty ground and vegetation. It does not vanish in a magical sense. It changes location. It enters soil. It feeds plants. It evaporates. It returns to the atmosphere. But it does not arrive where the water system counted on it arriving. This is the hidden path from climate to Lake Mead. First, heat reaches the snow. Then it reaches the soil. Then it reaches the plant. Then it reaches the river. Then it reaches the reservoir. Then it reaches the dam. Then it reaches a human life. A farmer may not use the word aridification while standing at the edge of a field. The farmer may see something simpler and more brutal. The allocation is uncertain. The irrigation window is shorter. The soil is dry before planting. A crop that once made economic sense becomes a risk. A cutting of hay may be skipped. A field may be fallowed. A loan payment may become harder. A worker may lose hours. A family meal may become more expensive somewhere far downstream in the economy. What began as atmospheric heat has moved through snow, dirt, crop roots, water law, labor, and income. That is the mechanism in human form. The same mechanism moves through electricity. Hoover Dam does not create power merely because water exists behind concrete. It creates power because elevated water has potential energy. The higher the reservoir surface, the more pressure pushes water through the turbines. As Lake Mead falls, the dam loses head. Head is the height difference that gives water its force. Less head means less generating efficiency and less available power from the same basic machine. The dam can still operate across a range of low elevations, especially with equipment designed for lower water levels, but the physics is unforgiving. A lower lake means weaker gravity work. In a hotter west, that matters at exactly the wrong time. Heat waves increase electricity demand as air conditioners run longer and harder. Nighttime temperatures stay higher, so buildings and bodies recover less. Hydropower, one of the flexible resources that can respond quickly to demand, becomes less dependable when reservoir levels are low. Again, the crisis does not need to become instant blackout to be serious. It becomes serious when the cushion thins. It becomes serious when a power grid facing extreme heat has less clean, dispatchable hydropower available from the dams that once helped stabilize the system. That is, aridification passing through a turbine. Research has made this mechanism clearer. A science study by PCD. Millie and Krista Dunn estimated that annual mean discharge in the Colorado River has been decreasing by about 9.3% for each degree Celsius of warming, mainly because warming increases evapotranspiration and reduces the reflective effect of snow. Another study focused on the basin's snowpack regions found that warming has caused disproportionate aridification there, meaning the places that generate much of the river's runoff are being hit especially hard. The striking point is not only that the basin is dry, it is that the headwaters, the part of the system that feeds the river, are losing efficiency. A river system can survive variability. It was built for variability, but it struggles when the conversion machine itself changes. The old assumption was that a certain amount of precipitation over the basin produced a broadly predictable amount of flow. That assumption is weakening. Under aridification, the same storm does not guarantee the same river. The same snowpack does not guarantee the same reservoir recovery. The same legal promise does not guarantee the same physical water. This is why Lake Mead can become frightening even without a single apocalyptic moment. The lake is the final display screen of a basin-wide process. By the time the waterline drops at Mead, the mechanism has already happened upstream. Snow reflected less sunlight. Soil took more meltwater. Plants transpired longer. Air demanded more moisture. Tributaries delivered less. Lake Powell received less. Releases were reduced. Lake Mead fell. The public sees the last step and calls it a lake crisis. But the lake is showing the output of a climate-driven accounting problem that began hundreds of miles away. And because the process is physical, it cannot be solved by optimism. Conservation can help. Recycling can help. Grass removal can help. Agricultural efficiency can help, although efficiency has complicated effects when saved water is reused rather than left in the system. Water markets, compensated fallowing, and new operating agreements can buy time. But none of those tools changes the basic fact that a warmer basin loses more water before it reaches the river. This is why the word aridification is more disturbing than drought. Drought asks when the dry period will end. Aridification asks how much water the region should expect, even after the dry period ends. Drought is a missing season. Aridification is a changed baseline. Imagine a household living from a savings account during hard months. A temporary drought is like a few expensive emergencies. The family spends down savings and waits for income to return. Aridification is different. It is like discovering that the paycheck itself has become smaller while the bills are still written for the old income. The family can cut expenses. It can delay repairs. It can borrow. It can sell something. But eventually, the budget has to be rewritten around the new income. Lake Mead is that savings account. Lake Powell is another. The Colorado River is the paycheck, and the paycheck is being reduced not just by demand, but by heat. That is the hidden mechanism behind the projected record low. The water level is the visible injury. The disease is a hotter basin, taking more water before the river can deliver it. Not all of Lake Mead's decline can be assigned to climate change alone. Demand, legal overallocation, reservoir operations, agriculture, urban growth, and policy choices all matter, but warming loads the dice. It makes dry years harsher. It makes recovery harder. It turns shortage from an event into a condition. That is why this moment feels so different. A reservoir can recover after one wet winter, and Lake Mead has risen before, when runoff improved and conservation reduced use. But aridification means recovery has to fight gravity, heat, and history at the same time. It means a wet year may bring relief without restoring the old world. It means managers can no longer ask only how much snow fell. They must ask how much of that snow survived the basin. The Colorado River system was designed around stored water, but the climate problem begins before storage. It begins in the sky and in the mountains, in the color of snow, in the thirst of air, in the dryness of soil, in the invisible pull of plant leaves, in the timing of spring. By the time the crisis reaches Lake Mead, it has already passed through the entire living machinery of the basin. So the core mechanism is not mysterious. It is brutally simple. Heat makes the basin thirstier. A thirstier basin gives less water to the river. A weaker river gives less water to the reservoirs. Lower reservoirs give less margin to cities, farms, dams, and power grids. And once margin disappears, every decision becomes sharper than the last. The frightening part is not that the lake is low. The frightening part is that the process making it low is no longer rare enough to treat as an exception. History matters here because Lake Mead has already taught this lesson once. The reservoir has dropped before. The West has already watched the white ring expand, the docks move, the forecasts darken, and the emergency meetings multiply. But the older warning was easier to misunderstand. It was possible to call it a drought, wait for relief, and imagine that the system would eventually return to the shape it had before. That is what makes the current moment more unsettling. The past did not disappear. It became the setup. The first major precedent is the drought that began near the start of this century. It did not arrive as one single failed rainstorm or one strange winter. It arrived as persistence. Year after year, the Colorado River Basin moved through dry soil, weak runoff, reduced storage, and higher temperatures. Lake Mead, which once seemed almost too large to seriously threaten, began to reveal slopes, canyons, old roads, old boat ramps, and the mineral line of a previous water world. What looked permanent began to look temporary. At first, this could still be described as a severe drought inside a stable climate. That was the comforting version. The basin had dry periods before. The Southwest had always been variable. The Colorado River had never been a gentle river. It floods, it shrinks, it carries snowmelt through desert. It has always demanded storage, law, and compromise. But then the studies started changing the meaning of the event. A major peer-reviewed study by Bradley Udall and Jonathan Overpeck examined the early 21st century Colorado River hot drought and found that flows during the period from 2000 through 2014 were about 19.3% below the 20th century average. The number mattered, but the explanation mattered more. The study concluded that warming had likely caused a substantial share of the decline. In other words, the river was not only suffering from too little precipitation, heat itself was helping reduce the flow. That was the first historical turn. The shortage was not just a missing supply from the sky. It was a hotter landscape taking more water before the river could use it. A later study widened the frame from the Colorado River to southwestern North America. It found that the period from 2000 through 2021 was the driest 22-year period in the region since at least the year 800. That is not a normal comparison. It reaches beyond modern gauges, beyond dams, beyond the legal life of the Colorado River Compact, and into tree ring reconstructions of soil moisture. It says the modern West is not merely experiencing a dry spell that looks serious on a short chart. It is living through a drought comparable to the largest events in more than a millennium, now intensified by human-caused warming. This is where the past becomes more than background. It becomes evidence. If the present decline at Lake Mead were isolated, it could be treated as an unlucky forecast. A bad snow year, a hot spring, a temporary operating problem, but when a low reservoir follows more than 2 decades of drying, and when that drying is documented in both streamflow studies and long-term drought reconstructions, the meaning changes. The lake is not a random victim of this year. It is the latest measurement in a long pattern. And that pattern did not begin only with climate. It also began with confidence. The legal architecture of the Colorado River was built in the early 20th century, when the river was divided between basins, states, cities, farms, tribes, and eventually Mexico. The Colorado River Compact of 1922 divided the river between the upper basin and the lower basin, with each basin associated with 7.5 million acre-feet per year from the main stem. That number became part of the foundation under Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, the Central Arizona Project, the Imperial Valley, Las Vegas growth, Phoenix expansion, and the whole idea of a managed desert empire. But a legal division is not the same as a hydrologic guarantee. The compact was negotiated during a period when the available record made the river look more generous than it has proved to be over the long run. Later, science showed what the law could not fully see at the time. The Colorado River can deliver less than the system promised, especially during long dry periods. That mismatch is not a footnote. It is the original stress fracture. The modern crisis did not begin when Lake Mead fell toward 1,036 feet. It began when a variable river was treated as if it could permanently satisfy fixed expectations. This does not mean the old engineers and negotiators were fools. That would be too easy and too false. They were building with the knowledge, politics, ambitions, and measurements available to them. They built dams that controlled floods, powered cities, irrigated farms, and reshaped the West. Hoover Dam was not only concrete, it was a promise that the future could be planned. Glen Canyon Dam was not only an upstream structure, it was a storage strategy. The entire system was an answer to uncertainty. The problem is that the uncertainty changed. A similar lesson came from the other side of the world, in Australia's Murray-Darling Basin during the Millennium Drought. There, extreme drought and decades of overallocation drove river flows to historically low levels, exposed the weakness of water rules, and forced major reforms in water management. The comparison is not perfect. Australia's law, climate, crops, and institutions differ from the Colorado River Basin. But the lesson is useful because it shows the same kind of systemic shock. A drought becomes more than a weather event when it collides with long-term promises, irrigation dependence, environmental needs, and political delay. In both basins, the most dangerous sentence was not, "There is no water." The most dangerous sentence was, "The system was built around more water than the future may reliably provide." That is why history must be handled carefully. The goal is not to say every drought is caused by climate change. That would be bad science. The Southwest has always had droughts, including megadroughts, long before industrial greenhouse gas emissions. Tree rings prove that. Paleo records prove that. Variability is part of the region's natural personality. A single dry winter does not prove a new climate. A single low lake level does not prove a permanent future, but the opposite error is just as dangerous. It is also wrong to say that because droughts happened before, the current drought is only natural. The modern event is happening in a warmer atmosphere, over a heavily engineered river, with far more people, farms, power systems, canals, and legal claims attached to every acre-foot. Past droughts happened in a different human system. This one is passing through dams, municipal growth, groundwater pumping, tribal water settlements, interstate negotiations, hydropower contracts, and global food markets. The same natural hazard is not the same disaster when the exposure is different. A dry period in the 16th century could stress ecosystems, indigenous societies, and regional food systems in profound ways. But it did not have to pass through Hoover Dam turbines. It did not have to meet contracts for millions of acre-feet divided across 7 states. It did not have to support tens of millions of municipal users, millions of acres of farmland, and power demand during hotter urban summers. The climate signal may have ancestors. The system it is attacking is modern. That is the historical trap Lake Mead now reveals. The West built reservoirs to defeat variability, and for many decades they seemed to work. Wet years filled the system, dry years drew it down. The dams created time, and time created confidence. Subdivisions expanded. Fields were irrigated. Cities advertised growth. Lawns spread across desert neighborhoods. Power from falling water became part of the electrical mix. A generation grew up seeing the river as infrastructure more than as a weather-dependent system. Then the drought kept going. Lake Mead fell to levels that once seemed extreme. Lake Powell fell too. Emergency guidelines were added. Shortage declarations became real. Temporary conservation deals were negotiated. Federal money was used to compensate cuts. New operating rules were debated. The system proved it could adapt, but it also proved something more troubling. Adaptation was becoming continuous. Each fix bought time for the next fix. That is the difference between a precedent and a warning. A precedent says this has happened before. A warning says the previous event taught the system what it would face again, only with less margin. The current projection toward a new low, near 1,036 feet, does not stand alone. It stands after the early century hot drought, after research linking warming to flow loss, after the 22-year megadrought reconstruction, after the first federal shortage declaration, after repeated emergency actions to protect Lake Powell, and after years of negotiation over what comes after the current rules expire. It is not the first alarm. It is the alarm still ringing after everyone has already heard the first one. That is why the comparison with the past is so powerful. In the past, Lake Mead's decline could still be framed as a reservoir recovering from drought. Now, the lake is being measured against a deeper question. What if recovery itself becomes less reliable? What if a wet year raises the lake, but not enough to restore confidence? What if the system does not need a permanent drought to remain vulnerable? What if repeated heat, soil dryness, and overallocation keep pushing the reservoirs back toward crisis every time the region relaxes? History does not say the West is doomed. It says the West has been warned. It says the river was overtrusted. It says heat matters. It says long droughts can expose hidden overcommitment. It says laws written around fixed volumes become fragile when the water cycle changes. It says reservoirs can hide risk for decades, then reveal it suddenly as a set of connected failures. It says the scary part is not one record low. It is the moment when the record low stops looking like an exception and starts looking like part of a sequence. The old shoreline around Lake Mead is therefore not just a mark of water loss. It is a timeline. It remembers the wet confidence of the past, the first years of decline, the emergency responses, the studies, the warnings, and now the possibility that a new low may arrive, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. A disaster that surprises a society is frightening. A disaster that was documented in advance is more haunting, because then the question changes. It is no longer only, how did this happen? It becomes, what did the system do with the time it had? The weakest part of a water system is not always the lake everyone can see. Sometimes it is an intake pipe. Sometimes it is a turbine blade. Sometimes it is a canal schedule written around a crop that cannot wait. Sometimes it is a power contract that assumed the dam would keep producing cheap electricity. Sometimes it is a household without the money to absorb a higher bill. Sometimes it is a tribal community with water rights on paper, but not enough pipes, pumps, or treatment systems to turn those rights into water at the tap. That is why Lake Mead's projected decline is more dangerous than the headline number. 1,036 feet sounds like a reservoir story, but the real story is what happens when that number enters small pieces of infrastructure that were not designed for endless stress. Start with the most literal point of contact between a city and the lake, the intake. An intake is not dramatic. It is not a dam. It is not a flood. It is a mouth in the water system, a place where the lake becomes a city supply. Southern Nevada understood this vulnerability earlier than most places. because Las Vegas depends heavily on Lake Mead. When the lake fell, the question was not only how much water remained in the reservoir, the question was whether the city could still reach it. That is why Southern Nevada built intake number 3 and the low lake level pumping station. These projects were not decorative improvements, they were survival engineering. They were built because the older assumption that the lake would remain high enough for existing intakes to operate comfortably no longer looked safe. The deeper intake and low-level pumping system were designed to help Southern Nevada access water, even if Lake Mead falls below elevations that would disable older pathways. That is resilience. But it is also a confession. A city does not tunnel deeper into a reservoir because the old world is stable. It does that because the old margin is gone. Las Vegas is often criticized as the symbol of desert excess, but the water story is more complicated. Southern Nevada has cut consumptive water use, even as its population has grown. It has removed grass, recycled indoor water, restricted waste, and invested in infrastructure. The city has done many of the things a dry region is supposed to do, and still, the deeper intake had to be built. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Good adaptation can reduce risk without eliminating the larger crisis. A better straw does not refill the cup. Now move from the intake to the dam. At Hoover Dam, vulnerability has a different shape. It is not about whether the water can be reached. It is about whether the water has enough height to do work. Hydropower depends on head, the vertical distance that gives water pressure as it falls through the turbines. When Lake Mead is high, gravity arrives with force. When Lake Mead falls, that force weakens. The dam can still be there. The concrete can still look invincible. The turbines can still exist, but the energy available from the same water declines. This is where 1 foot becomes more than a measurement. Federal technical assessments have warned that older Hoover Dam turbines face severe operating problems below about 1,035 feet of Lake Mead elevation, and updated data show that available generating capacity at that elevation could drop sharply compared with earlier estimates. That does not mean Hoover Dam instantly becomes useless. Some equipment has been upgraded, and the dam has been studied for lower lake operations. But it does mean the system begins losing one of its valuable forms of flexibility. Hydropower is not just electricity. It is electricity that can respond quickly. It can help during peak demand. It can support customers who have long depended on relatively low-cost power from the dam. When Lake Mead falls, the loss is not only measured in megawatts. It moves into utility budgets, replacement power costs, grid planning, and eventually bills. This is the second weak point. The turbine, as a financial hinge. A household may never think about Lake Mead when turning on an air conditioner. But during a brutal summer, the chain becomes real. Hotter nights keep buildings from cooling. Air conditioners run longer. Electricity demand rises. If hydropower is weaker at the same time, utilities must find power elsewhere. That replacement power can be more expensive. The higher cost does not fall evenly. For wealthier households, it may be an irritation. For low-income households, it can become a choice between cooling, food, medicine, rent, or debt. This is how a falling reservoir enters a bedroom at night. It does not enter as a wave. It enters as heat that will not leave, a bill that will not shrink, and a grid with less margin when people need cooling most. Then there is agriculture, where the weak point is often not a pipe or a turbine, but a calendar. Crops do not wait for interstate negotiations. They do not pause while basin states debate a conservation plan. They need water at certain stages, in certain amounts, under certain temperatures. A farmer can adapt, but adaptation has limits. A field planted under one assumption can become a loss under another. A hay cutting can be skipped. A vegetable crop can become too risky. A worker's hours can disappear before a city resident ever notices a change at the grocery store. Agriculture uses the largest share of Colorado River water, and that fact is sometimes presented as if it solves the problem. Just cut farms, the argument goes. But the real system is harder. Farms are not empty land. They are workers, families, local tax bases, equipment loans, packing facilities, feed supplies, tribal economies, and rural towns. Cutting agricultural use may be necessary in some places, but it is not painless. Water saved on paper becomes income lost somewhere else, unless the transition is planned with care. The small part that can break here is the planting window. Miss it, and the season changes. Miss enough seasons, and the community changes. In Arizona, reductions to Colorado River deliveries have already forced difficult choices for water users, especially those connected to the Central Arizona Project. In California's Imperial and Palo Verde valleys, conservation discussions often involve fallowing land, paying farmers to use less water, or shifting water between uses. These can be reasonable tools. They can also become socially explosive when rural communities feel that the burden of saving the river is being transferred onto them, while urban growth continues somewhere else. That is not only a water question, it is a trust question. The next layer is tribal water. Across the Colorado River Basin, tribal nations hold significant rights, including some of the most senior rights in the system. But rights are not the same as delivered water. Many communities still face gaps in infrastructure, funding, treatment systems, and distribution networks. In some places, the problem is not that a tribe lacks a legal claim. The problem is that the physical system needed to use that water has been delayed, underbuilt, or never fully funded. A shrinking river makes this injustice sharper. When water is abundant, a paper right can be ignored for longer. When scarcity deepens, every unused, unresolved, or undelivered right becomes part of a political fight. Tribes are not just stakeholders to be consulted after states make a plan. They are sovereign governments with legal rights and lived exposure. Any future Colorado River deal that treats tribal water as an afterthought is not only morally weak, it is structurally incomplete. The weak point here is the distance between law and pipe. A court decision does not fill a storage tank. A settlement does not repair a treatment plant by itself. A signed agreement does not shorten the road between a remote home and safe running water. When Lake Mead falls, the system is forced to ask whether it will protect those who already have pumps, lawyers, and financing, or whether it will also protect those whose water security has been postponed for generations. There is also Mexico, the downstream neighbor that turns Lake Mead from a domestic reservoir into an international issue. The Colorado River does not stop being stressed at the border. Deliveries to Mexico are governed by treaty and later agreements that have allowed shared shortages, conservation investments, and environmental flows into the delta. But scarcity still carries diplomatic weight. If the river shrinks and the reservoirs fall, the pressure does not remain neatly inside American state lines. The weak point here is cooperation. Agreements work best when there is enough water to make compromise feel manageable. When water drops, every acre-foot becomes more visible. Cities see farms. Farms see cities. Upper basin states see lower basin demand. Lower basin states see upstream storage. Tribes see promises delayed. Mexico sees a river shared across a border. Environmental advocates see habitats treated as optional. Power customers see energy risk. Everyone sees the same river and a different emergency. This is why the headline number is not enough. A reservoir elevation can make people think in vertical terms. Higher is safer. Lower is worse. But vulnerability spreads horizontally. It moves from the lake into pipes, dams, canals, fields, bills, treaties, and bodies. It touches the elderly person who needs air conditioning during a heat wave. It touches the farm worker whose hours vanish when acreage is fallowed. It touches the tribal household still waiting for reliable water infrastructure. It touches the small utility buying replacement power. It touches the marina worker, the rafting guide, the restaurant near a boat ramp, the student whose town depends on an agricultural tax base, and the family whose grocery bill rises after a season of water stress. The crisis is not equal, because systems are not equal. A wealthy city can build deeper, a small town may not. A powerful irrigation district can negotiate, a household cannot. A state agency can hire hydrologists and lawyers. A rural family can only wait for the decision to arrive in the form of a bill, a restriction, a job loss, or a dry field. The same falling lake produces different levels of harm, depending on who has infrastructure, money, legal power, and political access. That is the human geography of Lake Mead. The worst part is not that the lake may set a record low. The worst part is that the falling water reveals who has been protected by hidden engineering and who has been left closer to the edge. It shows that resilience is not evenly distributed. Some communities have deeper intakes. Some have backup supplies. Some have capital plans, conservation programs, and emergency contracts. Others have aging pipes, shallow wells, unresolved rights, limited tax bases, and little room to absorb another shock. And when a system with uneven protection loses margin, the first failures do not appear everywhere at once. They appear in the places where the margin was already thin. A turbine loses efficiency. A farm misses a planting window. A small power customer pays more. A marina closes a ramp. A tribal settlement waits for infrastructure. A low-income family faces heat with less ability to pay for cooling. A rural county loses seasonal income. A city spends millions to chase the water downhill. None of these looks like the end of the Colorado River. Together, they are the map of systemic risk. Lake Mead is often described as if the danger begins at the bottom. Dead pool, minimum power pool, record low. But the true danger begins long before the bottom, because infrastructure does not fail only when water disappears. It fails when water becomes too low, too uncertain, too expensive, too legally contested, or too unevenly delivered for the old system to function smoothly. That is the layer beneath the headline. Not one lake, not one number, not one dramatic collapse. A chain of small weak points, each connected to the next, each waiting for the waterline to move just far enough. Lake Mead is no longer just a reservoir. It is becoming a systems test. That phrase can sound cold, but it is the most accurate way to understand the crisis. A reservoir stores water, but Lake Mead now stores something else too. It stores the assumptions of an entire region. It stores the belief that a desert metropolis can keep growing if it conserves efficiently enough. It stores the belief that farms can keep producing with negotiated reductions and temporary payments. It stores the belief that hydropower can remain dependable even as reservoirs fall. It stores the belief that law can divide a river more precisely than climate can shrink it. And when the water drops, those assumptions begin to surface like old roads on the lake bed. The Colorado River system was built to make uncertainty manageable. Dams, canals, pumping stations, interstate agreements, treaties, shortage tiers, and drought plans were all designed to turn a variable river into a predictable supply. That was the great promise of the 20th century West. Build storage, move water, generate power, grow food, expand cities, write rules, smooth out dry years. But Lake Mead is now asking whether the system can still smooth out dry years when the dry years are hotter, the soil is thirstier, the reservoirs are lower, and the rules are expiring. This is where the story widens beyond one lake. The current operating framework for Lake Powell and Lake Mead was never meant to be permanent. The 2007 interim guidelines were built as temporary rules for managing shortages and coordinated reservoir operations. They were supposed to guide the system through a difficult period, but now the interim period has become the climate period. The temporary rules are reaching their end, while the underlying problem has not ended at all. That is why the post-2026 negotiations matter so much. They are not just paperwork. They are the attempt to rewrite the operating instructions for the largest river system in the American Southwest, while the system is already under stress. The Bureau of Reclamation has released a draft environmental impact statement for post-2026 operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Thousands of comments have come in. States, tribes, irrigation districts, cities, environmental groups, power users, and Mexico all have interests tied to the outcome. Everyone is looking at the same falling reservoirs. Not everyone is looking at the same solution. The conflict is structural. Upper basin states point out that they use less water than their legal apportionments, and that their supplies are more directly limited by snowpack and runoff. Lower basin states point out that Lake Mead is the immediate storage account for tens of millions of people, major farms, and major cities, and that measured conservation must happen fast enough to protect the reservoirs. Arizona, California, and Nevada have advanced short-term conservation proposals involving millions of acre-feet of savings. The federal government is reviewing options. Negotiations continue, but the river is not waiting for consensus. That is the new baseline. A new baseline does not mean every year is worse than the last. It does not mean the river never has wet years. It means the old assumption of recovery becomes unreliable. A good snow year can still lift reservoirs. A strong monsoon can still help parts of the basin. Conservation can still slow the decline, but the system can no longer plan as if a return to the old average will rescue every difficult decision. The average itself has become less trustworthy because heat changes how much water reaches the river. This is the deeper meaning of Lake Mead falling toward record territory. It is not only a storage problem, it is a governance problem. It is a power problem. It is a food problem. It is an equity problem. It is a timing problem. Governance becomes fragile because the river is governed by rules written around quantities that may no longer match physical reality. The law of the river is not one law, but a layered structure of compacts, court decisions, statutes, contracts, regulations, treaties, and operating guidelines. It is impressive, complex, and historically powerful. But complexity does not automatically create flexibility. In a shrinking system, every rule that once provided certainty can also become a point of conflict. A water user with a senior right sees security. A junior user sees exposure. A city sees public health and economic survival. A farm district sees food production and rural livelihoods. A tribe sees sovereignty and promises long delayed. An environmental group sees a river whose ecosystems have already been treated as leftovers. Mexico sees an international obligation. A dam operator sees elevation thresholds. A power customer sees megawatts. Each perspective is real. Each is incomplete without the others. That is what makes the system so hard to repair. There is no single villain large enough to explain the whole crisis. Climate change is intensifying the shortage, but climate change did not write every water contract. Agriculture uses the largest share of water, but farms are also part of food systems and rural economies. Cities have grown in dry places, but many cities have also achieved major per-person conservation gains. Dams created ecological damage, but they also provide storage, flood control, and power. The truth is not clean. The system is stressed because many rational decisions, made over decades, added up to a river with too little spare capacity. And now, the spare capacity is the story. A system with spare capacity can absorb errors. A dry winter hurts, but it does not dominate politics. A hot summer strains, power demand, but hydropower helps. A legal dispute drags on, but reservoirs buy time. A city grows, but conservation offsets some demand. A farm district takes a cut, but compensation softens the blow. Spare capacity allows society to be imperfect. A system without spare capacity punishes imperfection quickly. If Lake Powell must be protected, Lake Mead may receive less water. If Lake Mead must be protected, someone must use less water downstream. If downstream users cut too slowly, the reservoirs fall. If cuts are too abrupt, rural economies and vulnerable communities suffer. If hydropower declines, replacement energy costs rise. If energy costs rise during extreme heat, low-income households feel the danger first. If water deals exclude tribes or leave infrastructure unfunded, old injustice becomes part of the new crisis. If environmental flows are treated as optional, the river becomes a plumbing system with a dying ecosystem inside it. This is why Lake Mead is no longer just a warning about scarcity. It is a warning about coupling. Coupling means one part of a system is tightly connected to another. In a loosely connected system, a problem can stay local. In a tightly coupled system, a problem travels. At Lake Mead, A weak snowpack in the mountains becomes a low inflow into Lake Powell. A low Lake Powell becomes a reduced release through Glen Canyon Dam. A reduced release becomes a lower Lake Mead. A lower Lake Mead becomes hydropower stress at Hoover Dam, shortage pressure in the lower basin, and harder negotiations over who saves water. Those negotiations become budget decisions, farm decisions, energy decisions, and household decisions. The river connects them all. The old story of infrastructure was that connection made the region stronger. A dam connected snowmelt to electricity. A canal connected a river to farmland. A pumping station connected a reservoir to a city. A treaty connected countries. A compact connected states. The new story is more complicated. Connection still creates strength, but it also carries stress. When the river weakens, the connections transmit that weakness farther. That is why the response system can feel overloaded, even when people are working hard. Water managers are not doing nothing. Cities are not doing nothing. Farmers are not doing nothing. Tribes are not silent. Scientists are not guessing in the dark. The basin is full of studies, meetings, emergency actions, conservation programs, legal filings, engineering projects, and negotiation tables. The problem is not absence of effort. The problem is that the system is trying to adapt while the physical baseline continues to move. A treadmill is a useful metaphor, but Lake Mead needs a harsher one. The Colorado River system is like a hospital running during a heat wave, with every department already full. The emergency room is Lake Mead. The upstream ward is Lake Powell. The power system is the generator. Agriculture is the food supply. Tribal water infrastructure is the delayed treatment plan that should have been funded years ago. The legal system is the triage protocol. Climate warming is the rising temperature inside the building. Everyone can still work. Patients can still be treated. But the hospital is no longer operating with empty rooms. In that condition, delay becomes a decision. A delayed agreement is not neutral. It lets the reservoirs keep absorbing the conflict. A delayed infrastructure project is not neutral. It leaves a community more exposed. A delayed conservation program is not neutral. It forces sharper cuts later. A delayed recognition of the new baseline is not neutral. It keeps the old arithmetic alive after the water has changed. This is the central system lesson of Lake Mead. The West does not have to run out of water everywhere to enter a dangerous era. It only has to lose enough margin that every dry year becomes a negotiation over pain. It only has to lose enough reservoir storage that one lake can be protected only by stressing another. It only has to lose enough hydropower head that extreme heat becomes more expensive to survive. It only has to lose enough trust that each basin, state, sector, and community begins to fear being sacrificed first. That is how a reservoir becomes a mirror. Lake Mead reflects more than drought. It reflects the limits of 20th century water law in a 21st century climate. It reflects the cost of assuming that storage could make a river permanently reliable. It reflects the hidden dependence of cities on mountain snow, of farms on legal timing, of power grids on reservoir elevation, of treaties on shared scarcity, and of public confidence on the belief that someone else has a plan. The record low may be the visual climax, but the system story is larger. Lake Mead is showing that the future will not be defined only by how much water remains. It will be defined by how honestly the region rewrites its rules around the water that can actually be counted on. The new baseline is not a number on a gauge. It is a new relationship between society and limits. And once that relationship changes, the lake is no longer just falling. It is teaching. The most important thing now is not to make the story bigger than the evidence. Lake Mead does not need exaggeration. The facts are already heavy enough. So the first question is simple. What is actually connected? The projected decline of Lake Mead is connected to low inflow, reduced releases from Lake Powell, long-term overuse, and a hotter Colorado River basin. Those are not separate stories. They are parts of the same machine. The Bureau of Reclamation has projected extremely weak, unregulated inflow into Lake Powell for the water year. Around 3.27 million acre-feet, in the most probable forecast, only about 1/3 of average. Under that stress, the release from Lake Powell toward Lake Mead has been set at 6 million acre-feet. That is directly connected. Less water moving through Glen Canyon Dam means less help reaching the reservoir downstream. The lake is also connected to warming, but this must be said carefully. No responsible analysis should claim that one lake level, one dry year, or one bad forecast was caused only by climate change. The Colorado River Basin has natural droughts. It always has. It has wet years and dry years, strong snowpack and weak snowpack, storms that help one region and miss another. Climate is not the only factor. Demand matters, law matters, agriculture matters, urban growth matters, reservoir operations matter, groundwater matters, politics matters, but warming changes the background on which all those factors operate. Peer-reviewed studies have shown that higher temperatures reduce Colorado River flow by increasing evaporation, increasing plant water use, reducing snow retention, and lowering the efficiency with which precipitation becomes runoff. So the accurate statement is not, climate change alone made Lake Mead fall. The accurate statement is that human-caused warming makes the basin more likely to produce lower runoff for the same amount of precipitation, and that makes every management problem harder. That is what is real. Now, what is only happening at the same time? A hot week in Las Vegas is not proof by itself that Lake Mead will hit a certain elevation. A dramatic photograph of the bathtub ring is not a forecast. A viral video of cracked desert ground near the lake is not the same thing as a basin-wide hydrologic analysis. A boat ramp closure is a real local impact, but it does not automatically mean municipal taps are about to stop. A single storm does not save the river. A single dry month does not doom it. A May snowstorm can bring relief and still not solve the soil moisture deficit. A wet winter can raise reservoir levels and still leave the system overcommitted. This distinction matters because the internet compresses time. It takes a reservoir that changes by inches and feet and turns it into a moment of panic. It takes an operating plan and turns it into a countdown. It takes the word record and makes it sound like collapse is arriving all at once. But water systems usually fail differently. They fail through margin loss. They fail through cost. They fail through weaker hydropower, sharper legal fights, deeper cuts, delayed repairs, and communities pushed into decisions they cannot afford. That is less cinematic. It is also more true. There are also claims that are not supported by the evidence or that need much more context. One of them is that Hoover Dam is about to stop generating power simply because Lake Mead approaches the projected low level. That is not accurate. Hoover Dam's power production does decline as Lake Mead falls, because lower water means less hydraulic head. And recent federal assessments show a serious concern around 1,035 feet, where older turbines could face damaging cavitation and generation capability could drop sharply. But reclamation has also installed wide-head turbines, and official documents say those turbines extend generation down toward an estimated 950 feet. So the real risk is not instant zero power. The real risk is reduced capacity, more expensive replacement power, greater pressure on power customers, and a dam that needs infrastructure upgrades to remain reliable at lower elevations. Another false simplification is that cities alone are draining the river. Cities matter, and some urban growth has been reckless, but agriculture uses the majority of Colorado River water. That does not mean farmers are villains. It means any serious solution must include agriculture, compensation, crop choices, irrigation timing, rural economies, and food systems. Saying, just cut lawns, is too small. Saying, just cut farms, is too cruel and too incomplete. The river is not saved by a slogan. It is saved, if it is saved, by accounting. Another misleading claim is that the river is simply disappearing. That phrase may capture fear, but it hides the details. The Colorado River still flows. Reservoirs still store water. Cities still receive deliveries. Farms still irrigate. Dams still operate. The danger is not that the whole system vanishes overnight. The danger is that the dependable portion of the river is shrinking while fixed demands remain too large. A river can keep flowing and still be overdrawn. A reservoir can contain millions of acre-feet and still be in crisis. A dam can still generate power and still be losing reliability. There is also uncertainty, and uncertainty should not be treated as weakness. It is part of honest science. The exact elevation of Lake Mead months from now depends on weather, runoff, releases, evaporation, conservation, and operating decisions. The next snow season could help. It could disappoint. Monsoon patterns could bring localized relief without solving basin storage. Soil moisture could improve in some areas and remain dry in others. Negotiations over post-2026 operations could produce a workable framework, or they could harden into conflict. Emergency conservation could buy time, but time is not the same as balance. The uncertainty does not cancel the risk. It defines the risk. A person does not wait for certainty that a bridge will fail before inspecting the cracks. Water managers cannot wait for certainty that every forecast will come true before rewriting rules. The point of forecast modeling is not to declare destiny. It is to show the range of futures the system must be prepared to survive. When several plausible futures place Lake Mead and Lake Powell near dangerous operating zones, the rational response is not panic. It is preparation. So what is the real danger? The real danger is loss of buffer. The system is losing the cushion that once separated a bad year from a crisis. Lake Powell is low enough that protecting Glen Canyon Dam changes, releases to Lake Mead. Lake Mead is low enough that Hoover Dam's hydropower margins become more fragile. The lower basin is stressed enough that conservation proposals involve millions of acre-feet. The political system is strained enough that post-2026 negotiations carry the risk of federal action and litigation. The climate system is warm enough that the old relationship between snow and runoff is no longer dependable. That is the evidence-based warning. Not that every tap goes dry tomorrow. Not that Hoover Dam goes dark at 1,036 feet. Not that climate change alone explains every foot of decline. Not that one storm can reverse the system. The warning is that the Colorado River is entering an era where the old safety margins are no longer safely outside the story. They are the story. And once that is understood, the record low becomes less like a single shocking event and more like a truth-telling instrument. It shows what is related. It exposes what is exaggerated. It leaves room for what is unknown. And it points back to the one risk that does not need drama to be frightening. A river system with less water, less flexibility, and less time to pretend those are separate problems. At the beginning, the story looked like a number on a reservoir forecast. Lake Mead, falling toward 1,036 feet. A level low enough to pull attention toward the cliffs, the boat ramps, the pale bathtub ring, and the exposed slopes where water used to cover stone. But by now, that number should look different. It is not just a lake level. It is a message moving through an entire system. It moves upstream to Lake Powell, where managers try to keep enough water behind Glen Canyon Dam to protect operations. It moves through the valve between reservoirs, where a reduced release toward Lake Mead reveals a hard truth. When both savings accounts are low, saving one can deepen the stress on the other. It moves through Hoover Dam, where lower water means weaker hydraulic head and less margin for hydropower. It moves through canals, crop calendars, tribal water settlements, city conservation plans, power bills, negotiations with Mexico, and the homes of people who may never see the reservoir with their own eyes. This is the central warning. The record low is not the worst part. The worst part is the trade-off. A record low is an event. A trade-off is a new operating condition. A record low says the lake has crossed a line from the past. A trade-off says the future has started asking the system to choose what to protect first. Powell or Mead, hydropower or storage, cities or farms, short-term relief or long-term balance, legal certainty or physical reality. The crisis is not only that water is missing. The crisis is that the old system was built around the idea that enough stored water would usually be there to soften those choices. That idea is weakening. Lake Mead may rise again, A wet winter can still arrive. Snow can still build in the mountains. Conservation can still matter. Engineers can still adapt. Farmers can still change practices. Cities can still reduce waste. Tribes can still secure long-delayed infrastructure and a real seat in river decisions. Negotiators can still build rules that reflect the river as it is, not only the river as it was promised to be. This is not a story that requires despair, but it does require honesty. The Colorado River Basin is warmer than the system that was imagined when its great legal and engineering framework took shape. Heat does not simply make people uncomfortable. It changes the water cycle. It thins the conversion between snow and runoff. It dries soil before meltwater can reach the stream. It increases the thirst of the air. It lowers the amount of water that finally arrives at the reservoirs. Then the falling reservoirs carry that loss into infrastructure, law, money, electricity, food, and trust. That is why the white ring around Lake Mead is so haunting. It is not just the mark of a lower lake. It is the visible edge of an invisible process. It shows where confidence used to be stored. It shows how much of the buffer has already been spent. It shows that the West has been living not only on river water, but on the assumption that the river would keep behaving within the old range. Now, the range is changing. The danger is not that the American West wakes up one morning and finds the Colorado River gone. That is not the truth. The river still flows. The dams still stand. The cities still function. The farms still produce. The lights still turn on. The more accurate danger is quieter and more difficult. Each part of the system keeps working, but with less room for error than before. Less room in the reservoirs, less room in the power system during extreme heat, less room in farm budgets when water deliveries become uncertain, less room in tribal communities still waiting for water rights to become delivered water, less room in political negotiations when every acre-foot has already been claimed by someone's future. That is how systemic risk feels before it becomes obvious. It feels like normal life, continuing, but with the safety margins quietly removed. The lake will not tell this story in a single dramatic sentence. It will tell it foot by foot, a shoreline farther away, a release reduced upstream, a turbine operating under weaker pressure, a field left dry for a season, a water deal extended, a lawsuit threatened, a household paying more for power during a hotter summer, a community being told to conserve again while still wondering whether the larger system is being redesigned fast enough. Lake Mead is not the end of the story. It is the instrument measuring the story, and the reading on that instrument is clear. The Colorado River system cannot be understood as a drought emergency that will simply wait for a good year and return to normal. It has to be understood as a system entering a hotter baseline, with reservoirs that can still protect people, but no longer hide the mismatch as easily as they once did. The event will pass through headlines, the forecast will update, the lake level will move, it may fall, it may stabilize, it may rise for a while. But the thing this moment reveals will remain. The future of water in the West will depend less on finding one dramatic rescue and more on rebuilding the rules, infrastructure, and expectations around a river that can no longer be treated as endlessly negotiable. The opening image was a lake approaching 1,036 feet. The closing image is larger. It is a river system standing in a desert, holding two low reservoirs like lungs that cannot fully refill, while cities, farms, power grids, and governments listen for the next breath. The system is not dead. It is not beyond repair, but it is no longer operating under the climate that taught the old rules how to feel safe. And that leaves one question the falling water keeps asking. Even after the cameras leave the shore, can a society built around stored confidence learn to live around measured limits before the next foot of loss makes the choice for it?